My boyfriend kept pulling my hair saying it was love. I made him lose his. I'd been dating Nate for 8 months when he started this thing with my hair. Before that, we were actually good together. We'd meet up after our shifts at different restaurants downtown, grab late-night tacos from this truck that stayed open till 3 a.m., and just talk about everything. He was funny, had this whole stand-up routine he'd practice on me about working in kitchens, and my friends actually liked him, which was rare. We'd been talking about moving in together, had even looked at a few places near the university district. His mom loved me, kept inviting me to Sunday dinners. Everything was heading somewhere real until this one night in February. We were at his place watching some comedy special, and he gave my ponytail this sharp tug out of nowhere. First time, I laughed it off, figured he was being playful. The second time that week, I told him to stop because it actually hurt. He said it was his way of showing affection, like how some couples had their special thing. I told him my thing was not having my scalp attacked. He said I was being uptight and couldn't take a joke. That should have been my sign right there. After that, it became constant. He'd yank it when we walked past other guys, saying he was marking his territory. Pull it during arguments to lighten the mood, which just made me angrier. He'd do it in public, private, didn't matter. Once at his buddy Tyler's birthday party, he grabbed a fistful while I was mid-conversation with Tyler's girlfriend about her new job and pulled so hard my eyes watered. Everyone saw. When I got mad, he announced to the whole room I couldn't take a joke and was always so serious. Tyler's girlfriend looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. His friend Brad actually laughed and said I needed to loosen up. The worst part was how he'd gaslight me about it after. Said I was overreacting, that other girlfriends would love the attention, that his ex never complained when he showed affection. He'd pull my hair, I'd get upset, he'd make me feel crazy for being upset, then do it again 2 days later. My roommate Katie said I should dump him. My sister said the same thing. But besides this one thing, he was perfect, you know? Helped me fix my car when it broke down, remembered my coffee order, got along with my dad. I kept thinking he'd stop. The breaking point was at my cousin's engagement dinner. 30 people there, nice steakhouse, the kind with cloth napkins and multiple forks. I'd spent an hour curling my hair, wore this green dress he supposedly loved. Halfway through appetizers, right as I was telling my aunt about my promotion, Nate reached over and pulled hard enough that I yelped. The whole table went quiet. My aunt asked if I was okay. Nate laughed and announced we were just playing around, that I loved it rough. My cousin's fiancé looked at me like I was in danger. My mom pulled me aside in the bathroom later, asking if everything was all right at home. I wanted to sink into the floor and disappear forever. That night, I really looked at him, like, actually studied him while he slept. And I noticed something I'd always known but never thought about. Nate was completely obsessed with his hair. Had this whole morning routine with special shampoo he ordered from someplace in Korea for $40 a bottle. Coconut oil treatments every Sunday. Went to this specific barber across town every 2 weeks, wouldn't let anyone else touch it, not even for a quick trim. Had the guy's number saved as an emergency contact in case he needed a same-day touch-up before something important. Constantly posted selfies showing off his thick, dark hair, and had more hair products than I did. His ex even mentioned once that his hair was the thing she missed most about him, which was weird but made sense now. He was more attached to that hair than anything else he owned, including probably me. 3 days after the dinner, I went to his apartment when he was pulling a lunch shift. Still had my key from when I'd watch his cat. I took his precious $40 shampoo bottle and mixed in just enough hair removal cream to work slowly. Not enough to smell, not enough to work right away, just enough to cause gradual damage over time. I'd learned this from my cousin, who pranked her cheating ex the same way. Mixed it really well, made sure the color stayed the same, put it back exactly where I found it on his shower shelf between his conditioner and face wash. Then I waited and played the perfect girlfriend. Kept my routine normal that first week, showing up at his place like always, staying over 3 nights like we'd been doing since month 4. Every morning I watched him step into that shower, heard the water running, knew he was lathering up with the doctored shampoo while I made coffee in his kitchen. The cat would wind around my ankles and I'd scratch behind her ears, feeling this weird mix of anticipation and guilt that I pushed down deep. On Tuesday, we went grocery shopping together, and he grabbed my ponytail in the cereal aisle, yanking it back while reaching past me for his favorite brand. I bit my tongue and smiled, thinking about how his precious hair was already starting to break down at the follicle level, even though he couldn't see it yet. Friday night, we were on his couch watching some cooking competition show, and he did it again during a commercial break, this playful tug that made my scalp sting. I laughed and swatted his hand away, told him to cut it out, and he grinned like it was all so funny. Inside, I was counting down the days until the damage would start showing, until he'd understand what it felt like to have something you loved messed with over and over. Around day 10, Nate started touching his hair more than usual. He'd run his fingers through it while we were eating takeout, frowning slightly like something felt off. One night at his place, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a solid 5 minutes, turning his head different ways under the light. When he came back to the living room, he asked if his hair looked weird to me, if it seemed less shiny or something. I glanced up from my phone and told him it looked exactly the same as always. Maybe he was just tired from all those double shifts he'd been picking up at the restaurant. He nodded slowly, seeming to accept that explanation, but I noticed him checking his reflection in every window and mirror we passed after that. The seed of doubt was planted, and I could see it taking root in his brain, making him second-guess what he was seeing. 2 weeks in, Nate sent me a photo of his shower drain at 8 in the morning. The text said, "This seems like a lot of hair. Is this normal?" The picture showed a clump of dark strands collected around the drain cover. Definitely more than usual, but not alarming yet. I texted back that everyone sheds hair all the time, especially in the shower, and that seasonal changes could affect it. I mentioned that my cousin lost a bunch of hair one spring from stress, and it all grew back fine. He seemed satisfied with that answer, but sent me 3 more drain photos over the next few days, each one showing a bit more hair than the last. I kept reassuring him it was normal, totally fine, nothing to worry about, while watching the damage I'd caused spread slowly through his scalp. The hair removal cream was working exactly like my cousin said it would, breaking down the hair shaft gradually so it looked like natural shedding instead of sudden loss. The selfie obsession started around week 3. Nate's camera roll became filled with pictures of his head from every possible angle, trying to document whether his hairline was receding or if the crown was thinning. He'd take shots in different lighting, comparing them side by side, zooming in to examine individual areas. I'd be sitting next to him on the couch and he'd suddenly hold up his phone, asking me to look at 2 nearly identical photos and tell him if I saw a difference. I'd squint at the screen and say they looked the same to me. Maybe the lighting was just different. He started carrying a small mirror in his jacket pocket so he could check the back of his head in the restaurant bathrooms, at work, basically anywhere with decent lighting. His co-workers must have noticed him constantly touching and checking his hair, but nobody said anything to me about it yet. I watched him spiral into this anxiety loop, checking and rechecking and checking again, never able to convince himself that everything was fine. It was the same kind of obsessive worry he'd caused me when he kept pulling my hair despite my protests. That constant low-level stress of knowing something bad would happen again, but not knowing when. 3 weeks after I'd mixed the hair removal cream into his shampoo, the damage became obvious enough that other people started noticing. I was doing prep work in the kitchen at my restaurant when Hyun came up to me during a slow afternoon shift. He kept his voice low and asked if Nate was okay, said he'd seen him at the grocery store yesterday, and his hair looked kind of patchy and thin in spots. I wiped down the counter and told Han that I'd noticed too, but Nate wouldn't really talk about it, got defensive whenever I brought it up. Hyun nodded and said, maybe Nate should see a doctor because hair loss that fast wasn't normal for a guy his age. I agreed that was probably a good idea, suggested Hyun mention it to him directly, since Nate might listen to another guy better than he'd listen to me. After Hyun walked away, I felt this twist in my stomach, the first real pang of guilt since I'd started this whole thing. Other people were noticing now, which meant it was getting serious, which meant I'd actually succeeded in hurting him the way I'd intended. Nate called Sebastian that same afternoon, begging for an emergency appointment even though his regular cut wasn't scheduled for another week. Sebastian somehow squeezed him in late that evening, probably because Nate sounded so panicked on the phone. Nate left straight from his shift at the restaurant, texting me that he'd meet me at his place after. I waited at his apartment for almost 3 hours, watching TV with the cat and trying not to think too hard about what Sebastian might tell him. When Nate finally came through the door, his face was completely pale, and his eyes looked red like he'd been crying. He sat down next to me without saying anything for a minute, just staring at his hands. Then he told me Sebastian said his hair was breaking off at the roots, showing signs of serious chemical damage, but couldn't explain how it happened since Nate swore he hadn't used any new products or changed his routine. Sebastian suggested seeing a dermatologist because whatever was causing this wasn't normal and definitely wasn't stress-related like Nate had been hoping. I put my arm around him and asked what he wanted to do. Nate said he didn't know, that Sebastian had never seen anything like this before, and seemed genuinely confused. I suggested maybe the salon had used a bad product during his last visit, or maybe it was actually stress from work even though Sebastian didn't think so. Nate latched onto the stress theory immediately, saying he had been working a lot of doubles lately and wasn't sleeping well. He pulled out his phone and started Googling hair loss from anxiety, finding articles about telogen effluvium and stress-induced shedding. I watched him read through medical websites, completely missing the real cause sitting in his shower caddy 20 feet away. He spent the rest of the night researching stress management techniques and vitamins that supposedly helped with hair health, ordering supplements on his phone while I sat there feeling like the worst person alive. The guilt was getting harder to ignore, but I still couldn't bring myself to confess, not when he'd never really apologized for all those times he'd hurt me. Katie figured out something was wrong when I came home that Friday night and went straight to my room without talking to her. She knocked on my door after about 20 minutes and asked if I wanted to get pizza and watch something. I said I wasn't hungry, but she came in anyway, sitting on the edge of my bed and asking what was going on. I tried to brush it off, but Katie knows me too well, kept pushing until I finally broke down and told her everything. I explained about the hair removal cream, about watching it work over the past month, about Nate's appointment with Sebastian. Katie's face went through about 5 different expressions while I talked, ending on this mix of shock and disappointment that made me feel even worse. She said this was way beyond petty revenge, that I should have just dumped him instead of sabotaging his health like this. I tried to defend myself, but the words sounded weak even to my own ears. I started listing every time Nate had pulled my hair, every public humiliation, every time he'd gaslit me about my own pain. I told Katie about the engagement dinner, about my mom pulling me aside in the bathroom, about feeling so violated and disrespected for months while he acted like I was overreacting. Katie listened to all of it without interrupting, her face getting sadder as I went through the whole history. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute before saying that 2 wrongs don't make a right, that I could have left him any time, but instead I chose to hurt him back in a way that might be permanent. She said I was just as bad as he was now, maybe worse because I'd planned this out and lied to his face for weeks. I wanted to argue, but couldn't because part of me knew she was right, that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. A month after I'd doctored the shampoo, Nate's hair was noticeably thinner all over his head, with actual bald patches forming near his temples and crown. The thick, dark hair he'd been so proud of looked brittle and damaged, breaking off in chunks when he touched it. He stopped posting selfies completely, which was huge because his social media had been full of them before. He started wearing baseball caps everywhere, even inside his apartment, even to bed sometimes. The first time I saw him in a hat indoors, I felt this punch to my chest, because Nate never wore hats. Said they messed up his hair and ruined his whole look. Now he was hiding under them constantly, pulling the brim down low whenever we went out in public. His whole personality had changed along with his hair, going from confident and outgoing to quiet and withdrawn. I'd wanted him to understand how I felt when he kept violating my boundaries, but watching him lose himself along with his hair made me realize I'd destroyed something I couldn't fix. Nate stopped showing up for his shifts at the restaurant, calling in sick 3 times in 1 week. His manager started texting me asking if everything was okay because Nate never missed work, not even when he had the flu last year. I made up excuses about him fighting off a bad cold, but the truth was he barely left his apartment anymore. When I went over to check on him, he'd be sitting on the couch in sweatpants and that same baseball cap, staring at his phone scrolling through old photos of himself. The apartment smelled stale because he hadn't opened the windows in days. His coworker from the kitchen, this girl named Sienna, cornered me outside the grocery store one afternoon and asked if Nate was dealing with something serious. She said he seemed like a completely different person the last time she saw him, quiet and jumpy, not making jokes with the line cooks like he used to. I told her he was just stressed about some family stuff, lying through my teeth while my stomach twisted into knots. Sienna looked worried, said to tell him everyone missed him and hoped he felt better soon. I watched her walk away knowing I was the reason everyone was worried, the reason Nate had turned into this shell of himself. The guy who used to spend 20 minutes styling his hair each morning now wouldn't even look at mirrors when he walked past them. I caught him once covering the bathroom mirror with a towel so he wouldn't have to see his reflection while brushing his teeth. That image stuck with me for days, made me realize I hadn't just attacked his vanity or taught him some lesson about respecting boundaries. I'd destroyed something that was core to who he was, stripped away the one thing that made him feel confident and good about himself. He used to post selfies constantly, had hundreds of photos showing off different angles of his hair in different lighting. Now his social media was completely silent, no posts in over 2 weeks. His friends started commenting, asking if he was okay, if something had happened. I watched him ignore every single message, just scrolling past them with this dead look in his eyes. The guilt started eating at me in ways I hadn't expected, making it hard to sleep at night. I'd lie awake thinking about how he looked now compared to 2 months ago, how his whole personality had changed along with his appearance. Nate's mom called me on a Thursday evening while I was folding laundry. Her voice sounded worried, said Nate had canceled the last 2 Sunday dinners without explanation, and wouldn't answer when she asked what was wrong. She wanted to know if I'd noticed anything different about him, if maybe he was depressed or having problems at work. I sat there holding my phone, feeling my throat get tight, and told her I thought it was probably just work stress from the busy season at the restaurant. The lie came out smooth and easy, but made me feel sick to my stomach. She asked if I could talk to him, try to get him to open up, said she was really concerned because this wasn't like her son at all. I promised I would and hung up feeling like the absolute worst person on the planet. She trusted me, thought I was good for her son, had no idea I was the entire reason he was falling apart. That night, I went to Nate's place and found him researching hair growth treatments on his laptop, dozens of tabs open about vitamins and supplements and scalp massage techniques. He looked up when I came in and asked if I thought any of this stuff actually worked. I sat next to him and said maybe he should see a doctor instead of trying to fix it himself. He nodded slowly, said he'd been thinking the same thing but was scared of what they might find. 6 weeks after I'd doctored his shampoo, Nate finally made an appointment with a dermatologist. He asked me to come with him for support, and I said yes, even though sitting in that waiting room made my hands shake. The doctor was this older woman with gray hair who looked at Nate's scalp under a bright light for what felt like forever. She asked questions about his family history, whether anyone else had hair loss problems, if he'd been sick recently, or taking any new medications. Nate answered everything honestly while I sat in the corner chair trying to look supportive and concerned instead of guilty. The doctor ordered blood tests for thyroid problems, autoimmune conditions, hormone levels, and something called alopecia. She said they'd run a full panel to figure out what was causing such dramatic hair loss in someone his age. Nate left that appointment looking hopeful for the first time in weeks, convinced they'd find an answer and fix whatever was wrong. I drove him home in silence, knowing all those tests would come back normal, because there was nothing medically wrong with him. 2 weeks later, the results came back exactly like I knew they would. Everything normal. Nothing that explained why his hair was falling out in patches and breaking off at the roots. The doctor seemed confused during the follow-up appointment, said she'd never seen this pattern of loss without an underlying medical cause. She started asking detailed questions about his hair care routine, what products he used, where he bought them, how often he washed his hair. Nate pulled out his $40 shampoo bottle from his gym bag, the one I'd mixed the hair removal cream into weeks ago, and handed it to her. My heart started pounding so hard I thought everyone in the room could hear it. The doctor said she wanted to send the shampoo to a lab for testing, make sure there wasn't some contamination or bad batch that could cause this kind of damage. Nate agreed immediately, relieved they might finally have an answer. I sat there frozen, realizing I'd never thought about them actually analyzing the shampoo in a lab. Never considered they might find traces of the hair removal cream I'd mixed in. I waited until Nate's next shift at the restaurant, used my key to let myself into his apartment. My hands shook so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. I went straight to his bathroom and grabbed the shampoo bottle from the shower, the one the doctor had already seen and documented. I'd bought an identical bottle 2 days before. Same brand, same size, spent another $40 I didn't really have. I switched them out fast, putting the fresh bottle exactly where the doctored one had been, between his conditioner and face wash on the shower shelf. The cat sat in the bathroom doorway, watching me the entire time, her yellow eyes following my every movement like she knew I was doing something wrong. I shoved the contaminated bottle into my purse and got out of there, my heart racing the whole drive home. When I got back to my apartment, I threw the doctored shampoo in a dumpster 3 blocks away, wanted it as far from me as possible. I spent the rest of the day feeling paranoid, convinced somehow they'd still figure out what I'd done even though I'd removed all the evidence. 3 days went by before Nate called to tell me the lab results came back. The shampoo was completely fine, no contamination, no harmful chemicals, nothing that would explain his hair loss. He sounded relieved and devastated at the same time, glad his expensive shampoo wasn't the problem, but completely lost about what was actually causing this. I made supportive noises over the phone while my stomach churned, knowing I'd just gotten away with something but feeling no relief at all. Nate said the dermatologist wanted to try some treatments anyway, special shampoos and scalp treatments that might help stimulate growth even without knowing the exact cause. He asked if I'd go with him to pick up the prescriptions, and I said, of course, anything to help. We spent 2 hours at the pharmacy and a medical supply store, Nate buying bottles and creams and supplements that cost hundreds of dollars total. I watched him hand over his credit card for the 3rd time and wanted to scream that none of it would work, that I'd already destroyed his hair follicles beyond what any treatment could fix. He was draining his savings account trying to solve a problem I'd created, spending money he'd been setting aside for our potential move into a bigger place together. Every purchase felt like another weight added to the guilt I was already carrying. That night, he showed me his credit card statement, over $3,000 spent in the last month on treatments and doctor visits and special products. He laughed, but it sounded hollow, said he'd have to pick up extra shifts to pay it off, but it would be worth it if something worked. I sat there unable to speak, watching him plan his financial recovery from damage I'd deliberately caused. Katie invited me and Nate out for drinks with some of her friends the following weekend. I almost said no, but Katie gave me this look that meant she wanted to check on how things were going, see Nate's condition for herself. We met at this bar downtown where Katie's friend Megan works as a stylist at a salon nearby. Megan showed up still in her work clothes, hair pulled back in a bun, and immediately noticed Nate's baseball cap. She asked if he was growing out an undercut or something, and Nate got quiet, said he was just having some hair problems. Megan's expression changed, got more serious, and she asked if she could take a quick look since she dealt with hair issues all the time at work. Nate hesitated, but finally took off his cap in the dim bar lighting. Megan leaned in close, studied his scalp and the patchy areas where his hair had thinned out, ran her fingers gently through what was left. She made this small noise in her throat, almost like recognition, then sat back and told Nate she'd seen similar damage before. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Megan kept glancing at Nate's hair when she thought no one was looking. Later, when Nate and Katie's boyfriend went to get another round of drinks, Megan pulled me aside near the bathroom. She spoke quietly, Said Nate's hair damage looked exactly like chemical burns she'd seen from depilatory cream mixed with regular hair products. She'd had a client once whose roommate pranked her the same way, caused permanent damage to her hair follicles. My face must have gone white because Megan stopped talking and just looked at me with this knowing expression. She didn't ask if I'd done it, didn't accuse me directly, just said very carefully that this kind of damage might be permanent depending on how long the chemicals were in contact with his scalp. She told me that hair follicles can be destroyed completely by certain chemicals, that no amount of treatments or supplements would make them grow back if they were too damaged. Then she squeezed my arm once and went back to the table like nothing had happened. I stood there in the hallway between the bathrooms, my whole body cold, realizing that Megan knew or at least strongly suspected what I'd done. She'd recognized the damage pattern immediately, had probably figured out the timeline based on when Nate's problems started. Now someone else carried my secret whether I wanted them to or not. I drove home from the bar that night, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Megan knew. Maybe she didn't have proof, but she'd seen enough chemical burns from hair products to recognize the pattern on Nate's scalp. I kept replaying her careful words about permanent damage, about follicles that might never grow back. She hadn't accused me directly, but the way she'd squeezed my arm and walked away felt like a warning. I got back to my apartment around midnight and Katie was already asleep. I went to my room and lay on my bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nate's patchy scalp under the dim bar lighting, saw Megan's knowing expression. I'd wanted him to feel what I felt when he pulled my hair in public, wanted him to understand violation and humiliation. But making someone lose their confidence wasn't the same as teaching them respect. I'd just hurt him in a different way, destroyed something he valued because he'd ignored what I valued. Around 3 a.m, I finally fell asleep and had nightmares about Nate going completely bald, about him finding out what I'd done and showing everyone photos of his ruined hair next to screenshots proving I'd done it on purpose. I woke up sweating at 6 and couldn't fall back asleep. 2 months had passed since I'd mixed that cream into his shampoo. Nate's hair had stopped falling out as dramatically, but what remained looked awful. Thin strands that broke if he touched them too much, patchy areas where his scalp showed through, an overall texture that reminded me of damaged straw. He'd gone from someone who spent 20 minutes styling his thick dark hair every morning to someone who wore baseball caps everywhere and avoided mirrors. The confident guy who posted selfies constantly had deleted his social media apps. His whole personality had changed along with his appearance. We went to his apartment one evening to watch a movie, and I noticed he'd taken down all the photos from his walls, the ones where his hair looked perfect. He caught me looking at the empty spaces and said he couldn't stand seeing himself that way anymore. I asked if his hair was getting any better, and he shook his head, said the dermatologist told him the damage seemed to have stabilized, but the recovery would be slow. He didn't pull my hair anymore. Not once in those 2 months. But it wasn't because he'd learned to respect my boundaries like I'd hoped. He was too depressed to be playful at all. The guy who used to grab me and spin me around when I came through the door now barely looked up when I arrived. He'd stopped making jokes, stopped doing his kitchen stand-up routine, stopped suggesting we go out anywhere. We'd order takeout and eat in silence while some show played that neither of us really watched. His apartment felt heavy, like the air itself was sad. I realized one night while sitting on his couch that I didn't recognize us anymore. This wasn't the relationship I'd been in 4 months ago. We barely talked beyond basic logistics about when we'd see each other next. He barely left his apartment except for work shifts and even those he'd started calling in sick for. I was carrying this massive secret that made my chest feel tight every time I looked at him. The guilt sat in my stomach like a rock, getting heavier each day. I'd thought revenge would make me feel better, would balance things out somehow. Instead, I just felt worse, trapped in this relationship where I had to pretend to be supportive while knowing I'd caused everything he was going through. Katie asked me regularly when I was going to end things and I kept making excuses, said I couldn't dump him while he was already struggling so much. She pointed out that I was the reason he was struggling, which made staying even worse. Brad organized a guys' night the following weekend to try to cheer Nate up. Him and Tyler and a few other friends took Nate out to a sports bar to watch some game. I stayed home hoping maybe being around his friends would help him feel more normal. Brad's roommate Zach texted me around midnight asking if I was still awake. When I said yes, he called me instead of texting back. He sounded uncomfortable, said he needed to tell me something about the guys' night. Apparently Nate had gotten drunk and started crying in the bathroom. Zach had gone to check on him and found him staring at his reflection, talking about how his hair was the one thing he'd always been confident about. Said he'd never been good at sports or particularly smart, but at least he'd had great hair. Now he felt like he had nothing. Zach said it was hard to watch, that Nate seemed really broken. He asked if I knew what was going on with Nate medically, if there was something serious the doctors had found. I lied and said I didn't know, that Nate wouldn't talk to me about it much. Hearing that Nate had cried to his friends about his hair made something crack open inside my chest. I sat on my bed after Zach's call and felt physically sick. I'd wanted Nate to understand how his actions affected me, wanted him to feel as small as I'd felt at that engagement dinner. But instead, I just destroyed him in a different way that had nothing to do with learning or growth. He wasn't thinking about respecting boundaries or considering other people's feelings. He was just sad and broken and obsessing over his appearance the same way I'd obsessed over the pain in my scalp every time he yanked my hair. We'd both just hurt each other and learned nothing. I opened my laptop and started researching hair loss treatments, looking for anything that might reverse chemical damage. Most medical websites said the same thing. If hair follicles were badly burned by chemicals, the damage could be permanent. Some follicles might recover over months or years with expensive treatments, but others would never produce hair again. The only real solution for severe cases was hair transplants, which cost thousands of dollars and required multiple procedures. I found forums where people discussed similar damage from chemical accidents, and the recovery stories were depressing. Years of treatments with minimal improvement. I clicked through page after page, reading about scarred follicles and dead roots, about how some chemicals literally destroyed the cells that made hair grow. By 2 a.m, I'd learned more about hair biology than I ever wanted to know, and all of it confirmed what Megan had warned me about. I might have permanently destroyed Nate's hair. Nate mentioned during our next dinner together that he'd been researching hair systems. He showed me websites selling realistic hair pieces that attach to your scalp, said they looked pretty natural in the photos. Then he asked me very quietly if I'd still be attracted to him if he had to wear one. His voice cracked a little on the question. I looked at his face, at the hope and fear mixed together in his expression, and felt like the worst person who'd ever existed. I told him of course I'd still be attracted to him. That hair didn't matter. He smiled for the first time in weeks, said he'd been scared to ask. Then he reached across the table and took my hand, said I was being so supportive through all this. I squeezed his hand back and wanted to disappear into the floor. Everything I said felt like a horrible lie. I told him I'd love him no matter what, which was technically true, but also completely false because I was the reason he was sitting there asking if I'd stay with him through his hair loss. He teared up and came around the table to hug me, said I was the only good thing in his life right now, that he didn't know what he'd do without me. I hugged him back and felt his shoulders shake slightly, felt him holding on to me like I was keeping him from falling apart. The guilt was so heavy I could barely breathe. Katie cornered me in our kitchen 2 days later while I was making coffee before my shift. She'd been quiet around me for weeks, but now she looked angry. She said she couldn't watch this anymore. Couldn't watch me pretend to be Nate's supportive girlfriend while hiding what I'd done. Said it was making her physically sick to see me comfort him about a problem I'd created. I tried to defend myself. Said the situation was complicated, that I couldn't just confess now when he was already so fragile. Katie cut me off and said that was exactly why I needed to either confess or break up with him. Watching me lie to his face every day while he thanked me for standing by him was too much. She said if I didn't tell him the truth or end things within 2 weeks, she'd tell him herself. She wasn't going to be part of this anymore. I stared at her and felt panic rising in my throat. I begged her not to say anything, promised I'd figure out how to make this right. She shook her head and said there was no making it right. There was only being honest or continuing to lie. 2 weeks. Then she'd tell him everything. I grabbed her arm before she could leave the kitchen and asked her to please give me more time. Katie pulled away and said she'd already given me months of time while I played supportive girlfriend to someone I'd deliberately hurt. She asked how I could stand there every day watching Nate fall apart and not feel sick about it. I told her I did feel sick about it, that I could barely sleep anymore thinking about what I'd done. She said then I needed to do something about it instead of just feeling bad. I promised her I'd figure out how to make it right within her 2-week deadline. Katie looked at me for a long moment and said she hoped I meant that, because she couldn't keep this secret anymore. It was eating at her too. She walked out of the kitchen and I stood there alone, feeling the walls closing in. That night, I lay in bed thinking about just ending things with Nate and disappearing from his life completely. I could break up with him, move to a different part of the city, block his number, and let him think his hair loss was some random medical thing. He'd never have to know what I did. I'd never have to see the look on his face when he found out. It would be so much easier than confessing. But then I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I'd destroyed someone's confidence and self-image over something I could have just walked away from. I'd know I was the kind of person who hurt people and then ran away instead of facing what I'd done. The thought of carrying that secret forever made me feel hollow inside. 3 days later, Nate got a text from Tyler asking him to be a groomsman in his wedding next spring. Nate stared at his phone for a few minutes, then put it down without responding. I asked if he was going to text back, and he said he didn't know what to say. Tyler's girlfriend reached out to me the next day and said Tyler was really hurt that Nate hadn't responded about the wedding. She asked if everything was okay between them. I said Nate was just dealing with some personal stuff right now. She said Tyler really wanted Nate in the wedding party. They'd been friends since high school. I told her I'd talk to Nate about it. That night, Nate finally texted Tyler back declining the groomsman spot. He said he appreciated being asked, but didn't think he could commit to it right now. Tyler called him immediately asking what was wrong. I could hear Tyler's confused voice through the phone asking if this was about money or time off work. Nate just kept saying he couldn't do it, and eventually Tyler stopped pushing. After he hung up, Nate told me he couldn't stand the thought of being in wedding photos looking like this. He said he didn't want to ruin Tyler's pictures by being the guy with patchy hair in every shot. He'd rather just attend as a regular guest and stay in the background. I watched him explain this and felt my chest get tight knowing I'd taken away even this from him. The following week at work, I noticed Nate talking to our manager in the back office. They were in there for almost 20 minutes. When Nate came out, he looked upset and went straight to the walk-in cooler where he usually went when he needed to be alone. Later, I asked one of the other cooks what that was about. He said the manager had offered Nate a promotion to shift lead, which meant more money but also dealing with customers and training new staff. Nate had turned it down. I found Nate during his break sitting on the milk crates behind the restaurant. He was scrolling through his phone, not really looking at anything. I sat down next to him and asked about the promotion. He said he couldn't take a job where he'd have to be the face of the kitchen, where customers and new hires would be looking at him all the time. He said he could barely handle his current position where he mostly stayed in the back. The thought of being more visible made him anxious. I watched his entire life getting smaller because of what I'd done and wanted to throw up. 2 days later, Nate showed me a credit card statement on his phone. The total was over $3,000. I looked at the list of charges and saw appointment after appointment at different hair loss clinics, consultations with specialists, treatments that promised to restore growth, supplements that cost hundreds of dollars. He said he'd maxed out his card trying to fix whatever was wrong with him. He asked if I thought he should get another credit card to pay for the hair transplant consultation he'd been researching. I stared at that number knowing he was going into serious debt trying to solve a problem I'd created, a problem that could have been solved by me just breaking up with him months ago. He was paying thousands of dollars because I'd chosen revenge instead of walking away. I told him maybe he should wait on the transplant consultation until he knew more about what was causing the hair loss. He said he couldn't wait anymore, that every day it got worse. I nodded and felt like I couldn't breathe. That night, I told Katie I was going to confess everything to Nate. She was washing dishes and stopped with her hands still in the soapy water. She asked if I was really ready to do that. I said I didn't think I'd ever be ready, but I couldn't keep doing this to him. Katie dried her hands and sat down at our kitchen table. She asked if I understood what would happen when I told him. I said I knew he'd hate me. She said it might be more than that what I did could actually be considered assault or poisoning, that Nate might want to press charges. I hadn't thought about legal consequences. She said even if he didn't go to the police, everyone we knew would find out what I'd done. His friends, his family, our coworkers, everyone. I'd be the girl who sabotaged her boyfriend's hair because he annoyed her. That's how the story would get told. I said I knew all that, but I couldn't keep lying to him while he went into debt and turned down opportunities because of something I'd caused. Katie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she was proud of me for finally doing the right thing even though it was going to be awful. I spent the next 3 days trying to write down what I wanted to say to Nate. I filled pages in my notebook with different versions of the confession. Some started with apologies, some started with explanations about the hair pulling, some tried to make him understand how violated I'd felt. But every version sounded wrong. The ones that focused on apologies seemed too defensive, like I was more worried about how I looked than what I'd done to him. The ones that explained the hair pulling first sounded like I was making excuses, like I thought his behavior justified mine. The ones that were just straightforward facts sounded cold and dramatic, like I was confessing to murder. I rewrote it over and over but couldn't find the right words. Finally, I realized there was no good way to tell someone you deliberately destroyed something they loved. There was no version of this conversation that would make me look like anything other than exactly what I was. I texted Nate asking if we could meet at his apartment when we were both off work. He responded right away saying yes and asking if everything was okay. I said I just wanted to talk about some stuff. He sent back 3 texts in a row saying he'd been wanting to talk too, that he'd been thinking a lot about our future, that maybe it was time to seriously look at apartments together again. He said he knew things had been hard lately with his hair situation, but he didn't want that to stop us from moving forward. He sent a link to a 2-bedroom place near the university district that had just been listed. My stomach dropped reading his messages. He thought I wanted to meet to talk about moving in together. He was excited. I put my phone face down on my bed and tried not to cry. The day of our meeting, I got to Nate's apartment first. He'd cleaned up, actually cleaned, which he rarely did. There were fresh flowers on his coffee table, and he'd put out snacks like this was some kind of special occasion. He hugged me when I came in and seemed lighter than he'd been in weeks. He asked if I wanted something to drink, and I said just water. We sat down on his couch, and he immediately pulled out his phone to show me more apartment listings. He'd made a whole folder of places in our price range. I watched him scroll through them, talking about which neighborhoods had the best restaurants, which places allowed cats so we could get one together, how we could split the rent and still save money. His face was more animated than I'd seen it in months. I let him talk for a few minutes because I knew everything was about to change. I finally interrupted him and said I needed to tell him something about his hair. Nate's expression shifted from excited to confused. He put his phone down and asked what I meant. I took a breath and said I knew why his hair was falling out, that it wasn't medical or stress or bad products. I watched his face as I explained what I'd done to his shampoo, how I'd mixed in hair removal cream after the dinner at my cousin's engagement party, how I'd been lying to him for months. His expression went through stages. First confusion, like he didn't understand what I was saying. Then suspicion, like he thought I was making a weird joke. Then horror, as he realized I was serious. He stared at me and asked why I would do this to him. His voice was quiet and shocked. I tried to explain about the hair pulling, about feeling violated every time he did it, about how he never stopped even when I begged him to. But the words coming out of my mouth sounded pathetic compared to what I'd actually done. I'd permanently damaged his body because he wouldn't respect a boundary I could have enforced by just leaving. Nate sat frozen for maybe 30 seconds before the shock turned into something else. His face went red and he stood up fast enough that his phone fell off the couch onto the floor. He started yelling, asking how I could destroy his hair over something as stupid as playful tugging, asking if I was insane, asking what was wrong with me. I yelled back that it wasn't playful when he did it in front of my entire family at that dinner, when he humiliated me in front of 30 people and made my mom think I was in an abusive relationship. He said that was one time and I was being dramatic. I reminded him about Tyler's party and the grocery store, and every single time I asked him to stop and he didn't. He said those were jokes and I was too sensitive. I told him gaslighting me right now wasn't helping his case. Nate paced around his living room, pulling at what was left of his hair, and then stopped to face me. He said if I was that unhappy, I should have just broken up with him instead of sabotaging his body and lying to his face for months. He was right, and I knew it, but I also pointed out that he never stopped pulling my hair even when I begged him to, even when I cried about it, even when I explicitly told him it hurt. He said that didn't give me the right to chemically burn his scalp and destroy something he'd spent years taking care of. I said he didn't have the right to physically hurt me over and over while calling it love. He said I could have left at any time. I said he could have stopped at any time. We just kept going in circles with neither of us backing down. We went back and forth for over an hour, listing every way the other person had hurt us. I brought up how he made me feel crazy for having normal boundaries. He brought up how I smiled at him every morning knowing I'd poisoned his shampoo. I mentioned the time he pulled my hair so hard at his mom's house that I had a headache for 2 days. He mentioned how I watched him spend $3,000 on treatments for damage I caused. Every grievance we'd been holding on to came spilling out until we were both exhausted and hoarse from yelling. Nate finally sat back down on the couch and put his head in his hands. He said the hair pulling was wrong and he should have stopped the first time I asked him to. He said he knew he'd crossed lines and ignored my boundaries and that made him a bad boyfriend. But then he looked up at me and said nothing justified what I did in return. That I'd become just as toxic as he was. Maybe worse because I'd planned it out and executed it over months. Nate stood up and walked to his door. He opened it and told me to get out of his apartment and never contact him again. His voice was quiet now instead of angry, which somehow felt worse. He said he was going to tell everyone we knew what I did, and I deserved whatever social consequences came from that. He said his mom would be devastated, his friends would hate me, and everyone at work would know I was the kind of person who could do something this cruel. I grabbed my purse and walked to the door. I wanted to say something that would make this better, but there was nothing left to say. I'd destroyed his hair, and he'd destroyed my sense of safety in the relationship, and we'd both failed at being decent people to each other. I left Nate's apartment knowing our relationship was completely over, and that I was about to become the villain in everyone's story. Katie was waiting at our place when I got home. She took one look at my face and just hugged me while I cried. I told her everything that happened and she didn't say I told you so even though she'd been right about all of it. She just held me on our couch and let me fall apart. I cried for an hour straight thinking about how I'd let myself become someone who would deliberately hurt another person like that. Katie eventually made me tea and we sat in silence because there was nothing she could say to make me feel less horrible about myself. Over the next week, Nate told his friends and family what I did. His mom called me on Tuesday crying and asking how I could hurt her son like that after she'd welcomed me into their family. I tried to explain about the hair pulling, but she said that didn't matter, that what I did was unforgivable, and she never wanted to see me again. Brad sent me a text calling me a psycho and saying I was lucky Nate wasn't pressing charges. Tyler's girlfriend unfollowed me on all social media without saying anything. I watched my follower count drop as more people heard the story and decided I was the bad guy. Nate's version of events spread through our social circle fast, and I didn't even try to defend myself because what defense was there really? My own friends split on how to react. Katie stayed firmly on my side, saying Nate had it coming after the way he treated me. My sister said I went way too far and should have just left him instead of getting revenge. Some friends from college said they understood why I snapped but wished I'd handled it differently. Others stopped responding to my messages entirely. I felt completely isolated watching people I'd known for years take sides like this was some kind of war. The worst part was knowing that both versions of the story were true. Nate had violated my boundaries repeatedly, and I had deliberately destroyed something he loved. We were both wrong and both right, and the truth was just messy and sad. Hyun caught me after my shift on Friday. He stayed neutral about the whole situation, but told me Celine needed to talk to both me and Nate because the drama was affecting the workplace. Other coworkers had taken sides, and it was creating tension during shifts. Some people wouldn't work the same stations as me anymore. I'd heard through another server that people were avoiding Nate too, asking not to be scheduled with him. Hyun said Celine was worried about the hostile work environment and needed to mediate before it got worse. I thanked him for the heads up and went home feeling sick about how far this had spread. Celine called us both into her office on Monday before the dinner shift. Nate sat on one side of the small room and I sat on the other as far apart as we could get. Celine looked tired and frustrated. She said she didn't care about our personal drama, but it was affecting the restaurant and that couldn't continue. She made us agree to stay professional at work and keep our personal issues out of the building. We both nodded and agreed because we needed these jobs and couldn't afford to get fired. Nate wouldn't look at me the entire meeting. When Celine dismissed us, he left first, and I waited a few minutes before going to clock in. It was awkward and painful, but necessary. I knew we'd have to figure out how to work in the same building without speaking to each other. I heard through Katie, who heard through someone else, that Nate started seeing a therapist to deal with the body image issues and betrayal trauma. Part of me felt guilty that I'd caused damage serious enough that he needed professional help. Another part of me felt relief that he was actually getting help instead of just spiraling. I wondered if he told his therapist about the hair pulling, or if he only talked about what I did to him. I wondered if therapy would help him understand why ignoring someone's boundaries over and over was its own kind of violation. But mostly I just felt sad that we'd both hurt each other, so badly that we needed other people to help us process it. I scheduled my first therapy appointment the week after everything blew up at work. Found someone who specialized in relationship issues and conflict resolution. Figured I needed professional help understanding why I'd chosen revenge over just walking away. The therapist's office was in this older building near the arts district. Lots of plants in the waiting room and soft music playing. Her name was Dr. Anderson, and she had this calm way of asking questions that made me feel less like a terrible person. I told her everything during that first session, the hair pulling and the gaslighting and what I did to his shampoo. She didn't judge me or tell me I was right or wrong, just listened and asked me to think about what I was really angry about. Over the next few weeks, we worked through all of it. How I'd felt violated by someone who claimed to love me. How I'd wanted him to understand that feeling by attacking something he loved. Dr. Anderson helped me see that both things could be true at the same time. That Nate violated my boundaries repeatedly, and I responded by violating his body and trust. She asked me why I stayed so long after the hair pulling started, and I had to admit I kept making excuses because everything else seemed good. That was the hard part, realizing I'd ignored major red flags because I didn't want to admit the relationship was broken. We talked about why revenge felt satisfying in the moment, but didn't actually heal anything, just created new damage for both of us to carry. 3 months after I confessed everything to Nate, I ran into him at the grocery store on a Sunday afternoon. I was grabbing ingredients for dinner and turned the corner into the produce section, and there he was picking through avocados. His hair had grown back some, but it was still thin and patchy in spots, shorter than he used to keep it. He looked up and saw me, and for a second we just stared at each other. Then he nodded once and went back to the avocados like we were strangers who'd made brief eye contact. I grabbed what I needed from a different area and was heading to check out when he appeared in line behind me. We didn't speak until we were both outside in the parking lot and he said my name. I turned around and he looked tired, older somehow. He asked how I was doing and I said I was okay, going to therapy, trying to work through everything. He said that was good, and I asked how his hair was doing. He touched it automatically like he used to and said it was growing back slowly, but different from before. The texture changed in some spots. I told him I was sorry again and he said he knew. We stood there in the parking lot with our grocery bags and all this history between us, and I realized I didn't blame him for being cold. I'd destroyed something he loved, and no amount of apologizing would fix that. Nate mentioned he was moving to a different city for a better job opportunity, some kitchen manager position at a restaurant group in Portland. He said he needed a fresh start somewhere people didn't know about his hair situation or what happened between us. I understood that completely, how staying here meant always running into people who knew the story, always seeing the judgment in their eyes. He'd already given notice at his current job and was packing up his apartment next weekend. I asked when he was leaving, and he said 2 weeks, already had movers scheduled and everything. He looked relieved talking about it, like the move represented escape from all this mess we'd created. I told him Portland was supposed to be great for restaurant work, and he nodded but didn't really engage. We were just filling silence at that point, two people who used to know everything about each other now struggling for basic small talk. I apologized again for what I did, told Nate I genuinely hoped his hair recovered fully, and that he found happiness in Portland. He looked at me for a long moment and said he was working on forgiving me, but wasn't there yet. Maybe never would be. I said I understood and didn't expect forgiveness, just wanted him to know I recognized how wrong I was. He said he'd been in therapy too, working through the body image stuff and the betrayal, trying to understand his own part in everything. I appreciated him acknowledging that, even though what I did was worse. He said he should have listened when I told him to stop pulling my hair, that he'd been controlling and dismissive of my feelings. We both stood there admitting our failures to each other in a grocery store parking lot, and it felt sad and necessary at the same time. He said he needed to go, and I wished him luck. We didn't hug or shake hands, just went to our separate cars and drove away in different directions. Nate moved to Portland 2 weeks later, and I focused on my own healing and growth. I kept going to therapy every week, working on healthier ways to handle conflict and recognizing red flags in relationships before they escalated. Dr. Anderson had me journal about the relationship, identifying all the moments I should have left instead of staying and hoping things would improve. I wrote pages about the first time he pulled my hair and I laughed it off, about Tyler's birthday party when he humiliated me in front of everyone, about my cousin's engagement dinner when my whole family witnessed it. Each entry made it clearer that I'd ignored so many signs because I was afraid of being alone or admitting I'd chosen wrong. We worked on building better boundaries and learning to leave situations that made me uncomfortable instead of tolerating them until I snapped. I practiced saying no in small ways, turning down extra shifts when I was tired, telling Katie when I needed space. It felt strange at first, prioritizing my own comfort. But Dr. Anderson said that was exactly what I needed to learn. Katie and I had long conversations about the whole situation over the next few months. We'd sit in our living room with tea or sometimes wine and just talk through everything that happened. She admitted she understood why I snapped after months of Nate ignoring my boundaries and making me feel crazy for being upset. She said watching him pull my hair in public and then gaslight me about it made her furious, that she'd wanted to confront him herself multiple times. But she still thought I should have chosen differently. That revenge just made me as toxic as he was. I agreed with her, said I wished I'd just left him instead of destroying his hair. So Katie asked what I would do differently now if I could go back, and I said I'd leave after the first time he pulled my hair and didn't stop when I asked. She said that's growth, recognizing where you went wrong and committing to different choices. We talked about how hard it is to leave relationships even when they're clearly bad, how you convince yourself things will get better. Katie shared her own stories about staying too long with guys who treated her badly, and we bonded over our shared struggles with boundaries and self-respect. I started volunteering with a domestic violence awareness group that met twice a month downtown. I didn't think what Nate did qualified as domestic violence exactly, but I recognize now how boundary violations could escalate, and how I'd responded in an equally toxic way. The group ran support meetings and educational workshops about healthy relationships and warning signs of abuse. I helped set up chairs and hand out materials, listened to other people's stories about partners who controlled them or hurt them. Some of the stories were much worse than mine, physical violence and threats and isolation. But some were similar, partners who ignored boundaries and made their significant others feel crazy for being upset. I shared my story during one meeting, admitted I'd retaliated against my ex in a harmful way instead of just leaving. The group leader thanked me for being honest about my own mistakes and said recognizing our capacity for toxicity was important. Several people came up to me after and said they appreciated my honesty, that it helped them think about their own responses to bad treatment. 6 months after everything exploded with Nate, I was genuinely in a better place mentally. I'd learned that you can't fight toxicity with more toxicity, that revenge doesn't actually heal the hurt someone caused you. Dr. Anderson and I talked about how my actions against Nate came from a place of powerlessness, wanting to make him feel as violated as he'd made me feel. But destroying his hair didn't undo the months of him pulling mine, didn't make me feel better about myself, just added guilt and shame to the anger I already carried. I was learning to process difficult emotions without acting on them destructively, to sit with discomfort instead of trying to fix it through retaliation. My relationships with friends and family improved because I was more honest about my feelings and needs. I stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, stopped making excuses for people who treated me badly. Katie said I seemed lighter somehow, less weighed down by resentment. I felt it too, this sense of moving forward instead of staying stuck in anger about the past. My phone buzzed one afternoon with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it thinking it was spam, but something made me open it. The message said his hair was slowly recovering with expensive treatments, that he'd been in therapy working through everything. He said he forgave me, but never wanted to speak again. I stared at the message for a long time before responding, surprised he'd reached out after 6 months of silence. I understood the forgiveness but never speaking again part, how you could release anger towards someone while still needing distance from them. His hair recovering felt like good news, even though I knew the damage might never fully reverse. I thought about all the money he was probably spending on treatments, and felt that familiar guilt rise up. But I also recognized he was doing the work to heal, same as I was, and that felt important. I texted back thanking him for letting me know and apologizing one final time. I told him I forgave him too for the hair pulling and gaslighting, for making me feel crazy when I asked him to respect my boundaries. I said I hoped we both learned something from this mess we'd created together. I typed and deleted several other sentences, wanting to say more but knowing it wouldn't help either of us. Finally, I just added that I wished him well in Portland and hoped he found happiness. I hit send and watched the message go through, then deleted his number from my phone. It felt like closing a chapter, this mutual acknowledgement of harm and forgiveness from a distance. We'd both done damage to each other in different ways, and we were both trying to heal from it. That was probably the best ending we could hope for, given everything that happened. My sister texted me the next week asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We hadn't talked much since everything happened, just the occasional check-in message, so I knew she wanted to discuss the Nate situation properly. I met her at this place near her apartment on Saturday morning. She was already there when I arrived, 2 cups sitting on the table. She hugged me before we sat down and asked how I was really doing. I told her the truth for once instead of pretending everything was fine. I explained that I wasn't proud of what I did to Nate, that watching his confidence collapse had been harder than I expected. But I also said I learned important things about myself through all of it, about standing up for myself before things got that bad. She listened without interrupting and said she was glad I was being honest about my mistakes instead of just justifying them. We talked for 2 hours about boundaries and red flags and how I'd handle things differently next time. She made me promise I'd leave immediately if anyone ever treated me that way again instead of plotting revenge. I promised and meant it. I started going on dates again about 4 months after my last conversation with Nate. Nothing serious at first, just meeting people through friends and apps to get comfortable putting myself out there. I was way more careful this time about watching for warning signs. The first guy I went out with more than once was someone Katie knew from her gym. Third date, we were at his place watching a movie and he put his arm around me in a way that felt too tight, almost possessive. Old me would have ignored it or made excuses. But new me pulled away and told him directly that I didn't like how that felt. He got defensive and said I was being dramatic. I left right then and didn't respond to his texts after. Katie said she was proud of me for enforcing my boundary immediately instead of giving him chances to do it again. A year after everything exploded with Nate, my life looked completely different in good ways. I got promoted to shift supervisor at work, which came with better pay and less stress. I was dating someone named Daniel, who I met through my volunteer work. He actually listened when I talked, and never once made me feel bad for having boundaries. We'd been together 6 months and he still asked before touching my hair, even just to tuck it behind my ear. I told him about the Nate situation early on because I wanted to be honest. He said he understood why I snapped but was glad I learned from it. My therapy sessions went down to twice a month instead of weekly. Katie and I were planning a trip to visit my sister. I felt stable and happy in ways I hadn't in years. I still think about Nate sometimes when I'm doing random things like grocery shopping or driving past his old neighborhood. I hope he's happy wherever he ended up in Portland, that his hair recovered enough that he feels confident again. What we did to each other was ugly and painful, and brought out the worst in both of us. He violated my boundaries repeatedly, and made me feel powerless. I destroyed something he valued and lied about it for months. We both caused real damage to another person instead of just walking away. The whole experience taught me that revenge doesn't actually fix the hurt someone caused you, it just creates new hurt for everyone involved. You can't fight toxic behavior with more toxic behavior and expect to feel better about yourself after. I learned that lesson the hard way, but at least I learned it.